The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Millbrook boarding house as Samuel Wickham adjusted his camera equipment one final time. September 1890 had brought an unusual crispness to Crescent Falls, Ohio, and the photographer found himself grateful for the perfect lighting conditions that bathed the building's wooden facade in golden warmth. "Stand closer together, gentlemen," Wickham called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had spent years coaxing reluctant subjects into proper poses. Behind his thick spectacles, his eyes studied the two young men who had hired him for this commemorative portrait. The Hartwell brothers had arrived in town just 3 days prior, their Pennsylvania accents still thick on their tongues as they spoke of coal mining opportunities and fresh starts. Elias Hartwell, the elder by mere minutes according to their boarding house registration, shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other. His calloused hands smoothed down the front of his cleanest shirt, a gesture that betrayed his nervousness despite the confident smile he wore. Beside him, Tobias mirrored the movement with such precision that Wickham found himself momentarily disoriented by their similarity. "Are you certain this contraption will capture us both properly?" Tobias asked, his voice carrying a note of skepticism that made Wickham bristle with professional pride. The photographer had been documenting the growing industrial town for nearly a decade, and his reputation for quality work was well established among the miners and merchants who called Crescent Falls home. "My equipment is of the finest quality, I assure you," Wickham replied, ducking beneath the black cloth that draped his camera. Through the ground glass he could see the brothers perfectly framed against the boarding house's entrance. Their identical features were remarkable: the same sharp jawline, the same deep, set brown eyes, even the same slight scar above the left eyebrow that spoke of some shared childhood mishap. "Now, hold perfectly still for 30 seconds. The mechanical click of the shutter seemed to echo in the morning air longer than it should have. Wickham emerged from beneath his cloth with satisfaction, already anticipating the pleased reactions of his subjects when they saw the finished photograph. He had captured them at the perfect moment, their genuine smiles radiating the optimism of young men ready to build new lives in an expanding frontier town. As Wickham began the careful process of preparing his glass plate for development, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the boarding house proprietor who shared no relation to her current tenants despite the surname coincidence, emerged onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee. "How did it turn out, Mr. Wickham?" she inquired, her weathered face creased with curiosity. She had grown fond of the Hartwell brothers during their brief stay, appreciating their quiet manners and prompt payment of rent. "I believe we have captured something quite special," Wickham replied, though he would not know how prophetic those words would prove to be until he retreated to his darkroom later that afternoon. The development process unfolded with its usual mechanical precision. Wickham had performed these steps thousands of times, his hands moving with practiced certainty through the familiar chemical baths. But as the image slowly materialized on the glass plate, something made him pause. He leaned closer to the developing tray, squinting in the red, filtered light of his darkroom. Where two shadows should have fallen across the porch planks, only one was visible. Elias Hartwell's shadow stretched naturally beneath his feet, dark and well, defined against the sun, bleached wood. But where Tobias stood, the morning sunlight seemed to pass through him entirely, leaving the ground beneath completely bare. Wickham's heart began to pound as he lifted the plate closer to the light. Every other detail was perfect: the grain of the wood, the weathered texture of the brothers' clothing, even the slight movement blur of leaves in the background. But that missing shadow defied every principle of light and physics he understood. "Impossible," he whispered to himself, his breath forming small clouds in the cool, dark-room air. He examined his equipment with trembling hands, checking the lens for smudges, testing the chemical solutions for contamination. Everything appeared exactly as it should be. 3 times he inspected every component of his photographic apparatus. 3 times he found nothing wrong. The lens was spotless, recently cleaned with his finest cloth. The chemicals were fresh, mixed just that morning according to formulas he had perfected over years of practice. The exposure had been calculated precisely for the lighting conditions. Over the following days, word of the peculiar photograph spread through Crescent Falls like smoke through dry timber. Medical examiner Dr. Harrison Finch arrived from the county seat to examine both brothers, his leather medical bag containing instruments of measurement and observation that represented the cutting edge of the 1890s science. "Gentlemen, I must ask you to submit to a thorough examination," Dr. Finch announced in his office above the town's only pharmacy. His gray beard was meticulously trimmed, and his manner carried the gravity of a man accustomed to dealing with unexplainable phenomena in a rapidly changing world. The examination lasted 3 hours. Dr. Finch measured height, weight, blood pressure, and pulse. He tested reflexes, examined eyes and throats, and even compared fingerprints using a new technique he had learned from a colleague in Cincinnati. His findings, recorded in precise handwriting in his leather-bound journal, only deepened the mystery. Both men appeared physically identical in every measurable way. Their height matched to the quarter, inch, their weight differed by less than 2 pounds, and their vital signs showed no significant variation. Even their scars and birthmarks appeared in identical locations, as if nature had somehow created perfect duplicates. Yet the photographic evidence remained unchanged. No matter how many times different experts examined Wickham's plate, no matter what theories were proposed or tests conducted, the result was always the same. In that captured moment of September 1890, only one Hartwell brother had cast a shadow on the wooden porch of the Millbrook boarding house. Dr. Finch closed his journal with a snap that seemed to echo through his small office. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with deliberate slowness, a gesture that had become habitual whenever he encountered cases that challenged his understanding of the natural world. What you're about to hear challenges everything we understand about the nature of existence itself. The dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight as Professor Marcus Whitmore pulled the leather-bound ledger from the archive shelf. His fingers trembled slightly as he recognized the faded gold lettering. Dr. Cornelius Ashford, Medical Records, 1890-1891. This was it. After months of searching through the university's forgotten collections, he had finally found the first official documentation of the Hartwell case. The year 1890 had marked the height of America's industrial expansion, when photography was still considered scientific magic by many. Steam locomotives carried hopeful workers westward daily, their whistles echoing across the growing towns, while electric lights began replacing the familiar glow of gas lamps in progressive settlements. Most citizens still believed deeply in spirits and omens, even as telegraph wires connected distant cities with startling modern efficiency. Marcus opened the ledger carefully, his heart racing as he began to read Dr. Ashford's meticulous handwriting. The first entry about the Hartwell brothers was dated October 8, 1890. According to the doctor's notes, both men had arrived in Crescent Falls seeking honest work at the new textile mill. They appeared to be twins, though something about their appearance had immediately unsettled the townspeople. "Fascinating," Marcus whispered to himself, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he continued reading. Dr. Ashford had documented several strange observations about the brothers. Their skin seemed to have an unusual pallor, almost translucent in certain lighting. Their eyes, while identical in color, seemed to reflect light differently than normal human eyes should. Marcus reached for another document from the stack beside him. The Crescent Falls Parish Register confirmed that both brothers had indeed been baptized on the same day in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but the dates seemed inconsistent with their apparent ages. The registry showed their birth year as 1845, which would have made them 40, 5 years old in 1890. Yet every witness account described them as appearing no older than 25. The afternoon shadows grew longer as Marcus delved deeper into the archives. His excitement turned to unease when he discovered a sealed memorandum from the county sheriff's office dated October 12, 1890. The wax seal had been broken decades ago, but the document remained tucked away, forgotten. The sheriff's words were carefully chosen, referencing unusual circumstances requiring utmost discretion and phenomena that challenge conventional understanding. These documents began to paint a disturbing picture of two men who had arrived in town with seemingly innocent intentions. They had rented a small room above the general store, paid their rent promptly, and reported to work at the mill each morning without fail. Yet, even the earliest reports hinted at something fundamentally wrong with their presence in Crescent Falls. Marcus found Dr. Ashford's most detailed observations buried deeper in the ledger. The physician had noted discrepancies that defied medical explanation. When one of the brothers had suffered a minor injury at the mill, the wound had healed with impossible speed. Their body temperatures registered consistently below normal, yet they showed no signs of illness or distress. Most troubling of all, several townspeople reported seeing the brothers in multiple locations simultaneously, though such claims were initially dismissed as gossip. The local physician had conducted discreet examinations, though his initial findings were deemed inconclusive by the medical authorities. Dr. Ashford's private notes revealed his growing concern about the brothers' true nature. He had observed them during their required medical examinations for mill employment, and what he discovered had shaken his scientific understanding to its core. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the archive room, Marcus realized he had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple historical curiosity. The documents before him suggested that the Hartwell brothers were not merely unusual men seeking work, but something else entirely. Something that had managed to hide in plain sight among the good people of Crescent Falls. He carefully gathered the documents, his mind racing with questions that the papers could not answer. Who were the Hartwell brothers really? How had they managed to deceive an entire town? And, most importantly, what had ultimately happened to them after that fateful autumn of 1890? Marcus glanced at the final line of Dr. Ashford's notes, written in slightly shakier handwriting than the rest, as if the doctor's hand had been trembling when he penned these words. The professor read them aloud in the empty archive room, his voice barely above a whisper. The official records, it would seem, told only half the story. The wooden door of Foreman McKinnon's office creaked open at exactly 11:30 a.m. on September 15, 1890, as the Hartwell brothers stepped into the cramped space that reeked of tobacco and coal dust. McKinnon looked up from his ledger, his weathered face creased with the permanent scowl of a man who had spent 30 years underground. The morning light streaming through the grimy window cast long shadows across the room, and the westerly winds outside rattled the equipment sheds with such force that loose papers on McKinnon's desk trembled. "Hartwell brothers, I presume?" McKinnon grumbled, his voice gravelly from years of breathing coal dust. He pushed the employment register across the scarred wooden desk, watching as both men approached. Elias stepped forward first, his boots clicking against the floorboards, and signed his name with steady strokes. Tobias followed, his movements eerily fluid, almost gliding to the desk. McKinnon noticed something odd as he watched Tobias sign. The man's hand moved across the paper, but when McKinnon glanced at the carbon copy beneath, only Elias's signature had transferred through. "Strange," McKinnon muttered under his breath, squinting at the carbon paper. He looked up at the brothers, both standing perfectly still, their faces expressionless. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air seeping through the window cracks. The brothers were then escorted to the main tunnel entrance where Mine Supervisor Harold Jessup waited with his clipboard and stern expression. Jessup had been working these mines longer than anyone could remember, and his sharp ears could detect the slightest irregularity in the underground acoustics. As he called out instructions to the new workers, he noticed something that made him pause mid-sentence. "Follow me to Section 7, Jessup commanded, his voice echoing off the tunnel walls as they descended into the earth. The familiar sound of his own voice bounced back to him in the expected pattern, except when Tobias spoke. When the younger Hartwell brother responded with a simple, "Yes, sir," the words seemed to come from somewhere far away, as if traveling through vast, empty spaces before reaching Jessup's ears. The supervisor stopped walking and turned around, studying Tobias's face in the flickering lamplight. The man looked normal enough, but there was something unsettling about the way his voice carried in the enclosed space. "Did you hear that?" Jessup whispered to his assistant, Thompson, who had been walking behind them. Thompson nodded slowly, his eyes wide with confusion. "Sounded like he was speaking from the bottom of a well," Thompson replied, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of mining equipment. Before beginning their shift, both brothers were required to undergo the mandatory physical examination in Dr. Ashford's makeshift clinic. The clinic was nothing more than a converted storage room, equipped with basic medical instruments and a single examination table. Dr. Ashford, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, had performed thousands of these examinations over the years. He measured their height. Both men stood at exactly 6 feet. He checked their weight. Both registered 170, 5 pounds on his scale. Their reflexes appeared identical when he tapped their knees with his small hammer. "Everything seems to be in order," Dr. Ashford announced, making notes in his leather-bound examination book. "Just one final test." Nurse Catherine Bramble, Dr. Ashford's assistant, handed him a small examination mirror. It was a routine procedure, having workers breathe on the mirror to check for any respiratory issues that might affect their ability to work in the dusty mine environment. Elias stepped forward first, his breath immediately fogging the mirror's surface with a heavy cloud of condensation. Dr. Ashford wiped it clean and gestured for Tobias to approach. Nurse Bramble watched intently as Tobias leaned forward and exhaled onto the mirror's surface. Nothing happened. The mirror remained completely clear, as if no breath had touched it at all. Bramble's eyes widened, and he exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Ashford, who seemed too focused on his paperwork to notice the anomaly. "Try again," Bramble said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. Tobias complied, breathing more forcefully onto the mirror. Again, no condensation appeared. Bramble felt his hands begin to shake as he held the mirror, realizing he was witnessing something that defied all natural explanation. The first shift began without ceremony. The brothers were assigned to haul coal cars from the deepest reaches of the mine, a back-breaking job that required strength, endurance, and careful navigation through the narrow tunnels. The work was dangerous. Cave-ins were common, and the air grew thinner the deeper they went. Yet both brothers seemed to handle the physical demands with unusual ease. As the hours passed, other miners began to notice disturbing details about their new colleague. Murphy, a veteran miner with 20 years of experience, was the first to spot the footprint anomaly. The tunnel floors in the deepest sections were covered with soft clay that had been compressed by years of groundwater seepage. Every man who walked through these areas left clear, deep impressions in the clay, evidence of their passage that would remain for days. "Look at this," Murphy called out to his partner, O'Brien, pointing at the ground where the brothers had just passed. Elias's boot prints were clearly visible, pressed deep into the clay, showing the distinctive pattern of his work boots. But beside them, where Tobias had walked, the clay remained undisturbed, as smooth as if no one had passed through it all. O'Brien crouched down, running his fingers over the unmarked clay. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I saw him walk right through here with my own eyes." Word of the strange occurrence spread quickly among the miners. During their lunch break, several men gathered around the Hartwell brothers, their faces filled with suspicion and unease. The underground dining area was lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the rough, hewn walls, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a gathering of conspirators than hungry workers sharing a meal. "We need to talk about what's been happening down here," Murphy said, his voice steady but his eyes filled with concern. He looked directly at the brothers, who sat side by side on a wooden bench, neither of them eating from the lunch pails they had brought. Elias met Murphy's gaze without flinching. "What exactly are you concerned about?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. "Your brother there," Murphy pointed at Tobias. "He doesn't leave footprints. He doesn't fog mirrors when he breathes, and his voice sounds like it's coming from miles away when he speaks." The dining area fell silent except for the distant sound of water dripping from the tunnel ceiling. All eyes turned to the Hartwell brothers, waiting for an explanation. Tobias looked at Elias, and in that brief exchange of glances, every man present sensed that these two shared secrets that went far beyond ordinary family bonds. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation," Elias said finally, but his words carried no conviction. The way he avoided eye contact with the other miners only deepened their suspicions. Bramble, who had been haunted by what he had witnessed during the medical examination, returned to the clinic that evening to make a private entry in his journal. His hands trembled as he wrote by lamplight, struggling to find words that could adequately describe what he had observed. The implications of what he had seen were too disturbing to ignore, yet too impossible to believe. As he closed his journal and prepared to leave for home, Bramble made a decision that would prove crucial to the events that were about to unfold. He carefully recorded his final observation about the mysterious Tobias Hartwell. According to Nurse Bramble's private journal, something about, that man defies the natural order of things. Professor Edmund Whitmore stepped off the morning train on October 3rd, his leather satchel heavy with precision instruments that had never failed him in 30 years of scientific inquiry. The autumn air carried an unusual stillness as he made his way toward the Riverside Institute of Natural Philosophy, where two brothers had reportedly defied the very foundations of physics. His weathered hands gripped the handle of his case tighter, knowing that his reputation as the region's most methodical researcher hung in the balance of what he might discover. The brothers sat in the laboratory's harsh electric light, their contrasting appearances immediately striking Whitmore as he adjusted his spectacles. Elias bore the familiar marks of honest labor: calloused hands, sun, weathered skin, and the slight stoop that came from years of physical work. Tobias, however, appeared untouched by time or toil, his skin smooth and unmarked despite his brother's testimony of identical daily routines. "Gentlemen," Whitmore announced, his voice carrying the authority of academic precision, "I shall document exactly what nature has presented us." He withdrew his precision calipers, instruments capable of measuring to the thousandth of an inch. The metal felt cold against his palms as he approached Elias first, taking careful measurements of bone structure, muscle definition, and skin thickness. Each number he recorded fell within the expected parameters for a man of 35 years engaged in manual labor. When he turned his instruments toward Tobias, the impossible began to reveal itself. The calipers registered measurements that contradicted everything Whitmore understood about human anatomy and aging. Bone density readings suggested a man barely past 20, yet Tobias claimed to share his brother's exact birth date. The professor's hands trembled slightly as he recorded figures that made no scientific sense, his mind racing to find rational explanations for the irrational. "Hold perfectly still," Whitmore instructed, positioning his photographic plates to capture evidence that others might demand to see. The camera's flash illuminated both brothers simultaneously, but when he developed the plates in his makeshift darkroom, the images revealed details that challenged his sanity. While Elias appeared normal in every photograph, strange distortions surrounded Tobias. Shadows that fell at impossible angles and light that seemed to bend around his form in ways that violated basic optical principles. 3 days later, a telegram arrived that would deepen the mystery beyond Whitmore's worst fears. Dr. Marcus Steinfeld of the Philadelphia College of Medicine had received blood samples from both brothers, and his analysis confirmed what local physicians had whispered in hushed conversations. The wire crackled with urgency as Whitmore read the message aloud to his assistant. "Blood samples present unprecedented anomalies. Recommend immediate consultation." Steinfeld. The hospital records, which would remain sealed until 1942, documented the most disturbing discovery yet. Tobias's blood refused to coagulate under any standard laboratory conditions. No matter what clotting agents the medical staff introduced, the crimson liquid remained fluid, defying the basic biological processes that kept every human being alive. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, noted in his private journal that the blood seemed to possess an otherworldly quality, as if it existed outside the normal laws of biology. Museum curator Agnes Thornfield arrived with her cataloging expertise, determined to document the brothers' personal effects with scientific rigor. Her trained eye immediately noticed discrepancies that made her stomach clench with unease. Elias's work clothes showed the expected signs of daily wear, fabric worn thin at stress points, permanent soil stains from years of labor, and the general deterioration that came with honest use. Tobias's identical garments, however, appeared pristine despite his claims of sharing every work detail with his brother. "This makes no sense," Thornfield muttered, running her gloved fingers over fabric that should have shown identical wear patterns. "These items should have aged at the same rate, under the same conditions." She held up two nearly identical work shirts, one clearly showing years of use while the other looked as if it had been purchased that very morning. Her meticulous notes would later become crucial evidence in understanding the brothers' impossible condition. Professor Whitmore's optical instruments detected the final piece of evidence that would cement the case's reputation as scientifically impossible. His specialized lenses, designed to measure light refraction with unprecedented accuracy, registered atmospheric displacement around Tobias that suggested forces beyond current understanding. The light bent around the younger, appearing brother in patterns that indicated atmospheric displacement of unknown origin, as Whitmore would later write in his official report. The sealed letter from Reverend Samuel Crawford of the town's Episcopal Church arrived like a thunderbolt, describing an incident during Sunday Communion that had shaken his faith to its very foundation. The minister's careful handwriting detailed how communion wine had turned to water when Tobias approached the altar, a transformation witnessed by dozens of parishioners who could provide no rational explanation for what they had seen. Each expert who examined the case added layers of documentation that only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Geologists found no unusual mineral deposits that might explain the phenomenon. Physicians discovered no medical conditions that could account for the brothers' different aging rates. Physicists measured atmospheric disturbances that challenged their understanding of natural law. Every scientific discipline that touched the case emerged more confused than when they had begun their investigation. As October drew to a close, Professor Whitmore sat in his study, surrounded by mountains of evidence that pointed toward an impossible conclusion. His reputation for methodical analysis had served him well throughout his career, but this case had pushed him beyond the boundaries of rational thought. The precision instruments lay scattered across his desk, each one having recorded measurements that defied explanation. His photographic plates hung on lines like accusations against the natural order, showing distortions that made his academic mind recoil in disbelief. The weight of documentation pressed down upon him as he prepared his final report, knowing that his colleagues would question not just his findings, but his sanity. The brothers' case had attracted the attention of every major scientific institution in the region, yet each investigation had only served to compound the mystery rather than resolve it. The evidence pointed toward phenomena that existed outside the accepted laws of physics, biology, and rational thought itself. As Whitmore stared at the impossible data spread before him, he spoke the conclusion that would haunt scientific circles for decades to come. The more they studied the brothers, the more impossible their existence became. The evidence had piled up like autumn leaves in the wind, each piece more puzzling than the last. 3 men sat around the mahogany table in Sheriff Coleman's office, their faces illuminated by the flickering gaslight that cast dancing shadows on the wood-paneled walls. The October air outside carried the promise of winter, but inside the room, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Dr. Ashford leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together as he presented his theory. "Gentlemen, I believe we are dealing with a rare medical condition that affects how light interacts with the human body," he began, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. The doctor had spent sleepless nights poring over medical journals, searching for any precedent that might explain the Hartwell brothers' strange affliction. "Consider the evidence. One brother casts no shadow, while the other appears translucent in certain lighting. This suggests an abnormality in how their bodies absorb and reflect light particles." Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He had seen enough confidence schemes in his 20 years of law enforcement to smell deception from miles away. "With all due respect, Doctor, no such condition exists in any medical literature I've consulted," he countered, his gruff voice filled with skepticism. "What we have here is an elaborate hoax. Mark my words. These so-called brothers are nothing more than skilled actors using photographic manipulation techniques and stage magic to fool honest folk." The sheriff's theory hung in the air like smoke from his pipe, which he puffed nervously as he spoke. He had investigated cases of fraud before, where criminals used new technologies to deceive their victims. The recent advances in photography made it easier than ever to create convincing illusions, and Coleman was certain that the Hartwell brothers were exploiting people's fascination with the supernatural. Professor Whitmore, the eldest of the three men, sat quietly in the corner, his scholarly demeanor a stark contrast to the heated debate between his companions. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "Gentlemen, while both of your theories have merit, I must present a third possibility that may seem impossible to accept." He paused, removing his spectacles to clean them with trembling fingers. "What if we are witnessing temporal displacement? A phenomenon where one brother exists slightly outside the normal flow of time?" The room fell silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Professor Whitmore's suggestion challenged everything they understood about the natural world, yet it was the only theory that seemed to account for all the strange occurrences they had documented. The way witnesses described feeling disoriented in the brothers' presence, the temperature fluctuations, and the photographic anomalies all pointed to something beyond conventional explanation. Each theory explained certain aspects of the evidence while creating new contradictions that seemed impossible to resolve. Dr. Ashford's medical hypothesis accounted for the visual anomalies but failed to explain the environmental effects witnesses reported. Sheriff Coleman's fraud theory addressed the suspicious timing of events but could not account for the consistency of the phenomena across multiple independent witnesses. Professor Whitmore's temporal displacement concept encompassed the most evidence but required accepting possibilities that challenged the very foundations of scientific understanding. As October drew to a close, the investigation intensified. The three men worked tirelessly, gathering statements, analyzing photographs, and consulting with experts from neighboring counties. The pressure to solve the mystery weighed heavily on their shoulders, especially as reports of similar incidents began surfacing from other mining towns throughout the region. The breakthrough, or perhaps the final mystery, came on the night of October 31st, 1890. The autumn wind howled through the streets of Millbrook like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of supernatural happenings. At exactly 3:17 a.m., when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest, both Hartwell brothers vanished from their locked boarding-house room on the second floor. Mrs. Pemberton, the landlady, was awakened by a sensation she would later describe as the feeling of ice water running through her veins. The sturdy woman had managed the boarding house for 15 years and prided herself on maintaining order, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she discovered that night. The temperature in the hallway outside the brothers' room had dropped 20 degrees within minutes, causing her breath to form visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. She knocked on their door with increasing urgency, her knuckles rapping against the wood in a staccato rhythm that echoed through the silent building. "Mr. Hartwell." "Are you gentlemen all right?" she called out, her voice quavering with a fear she could not quite understand. When no response came, She used her master key to enter the room, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the lock. The scene that greeted her defied all logic and reason. The beds remained perfectly made, with no signs that anyone had slept in them. Yet when Mrs. Pemberton pressed her palm against the quilted coverlets, they were still warm to the touch, as if bodies had just risen from them moments before. The window remained securely latched from the inside, and there was no other way for the brothers to have left the room without passing through the door she had just unlocked. But it was what she found on the windowsill that sent chills racing down her spine like spider legs. There, propped against the glass, sat a single photograph, the same image that photographer Wickham had taken weeks before during his documentation of the brothers. However, this version of the photograph showed neither shadow nor figure, just an empty street scene that seemed to mock the very existence of the men who had once stood there. As Mrs. Pemberton stared at the impossible image, witnesses throughout the boarding house reported hearing whispers in an unknown language drifting through the walls like ghostly prayers. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a chorus of voices speaking words that no earthly tongue had ever formed. The whispers grew louder and more insistent before fading away entirely, leaving behind only an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the ears like cotton. When Sheriff Coleman arrived at the scene 30 minutes later, his boots echoing on the wooden stairs as he climbed to the second floor, he found Mrs. Pemberton standing in the doorway of the empty room, her face pale as moonlight. The experienced lawman had seen many strange things in his career, but the scene before him challenged his understanding of reality itself. "What happened here, Mrs. Pemberton?" he asked gently, though his own voice betrayed the unease that had settled in his chest like a stone. The landlady turned to face him, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to reach into her very soul. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, struggling to find words that could adequately describe the inexplicable events she had witnessed. Finally, she managed to whisper, "They're gone, Sheriff. Gone without a trace. But the room—" She gestured helplessly at the space behind her. Coleman stepped past her into the room, his trained eyes taking in every detail. The air felt thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He approached the beds cautiously, extending his hand toward the coverlets just as Mrs. Pemberton had done. The warmth that emanated from the fabric was undeniable, yet there was something else, an underlying coldness that seemed to seep through the warmth like ice through summer grass. As he examined the room more thoroughly, Coleman became aware of a smell that permeated the air, subtle at first but growing stronger with each breath he took. It was the distinct odor of coal dust, familiar to anyone who lived near the mining operations, but there was something else mixed with it, something that defied identification or description. The room smelled of coal dust and something else, something that had no name in any earthly catalog. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of mystery, the supernatural, and the eerie tension between reality and illusion. Its purpose is to raise awareness, spark curiosity, and inspire reflection on the unknown and the power of storytelling.